shift our focus to actual questions dealing with women and sexuality within a religious framework. And we're starting with one of the toughest, contraception and abortion. Okay, that's certainly different from when I was young. Okay, let's go on. So much for sex education in the schools. Wow. So some things don't change. It used to be like 90-something%. Okay. All right. Okay, I'm glad we have abstainers and we have pro-life people, because we really want this to be a dialogue, and you're not going to be challenged to think about your views carefully unless we have a real contrast of opinion. So this is actually a problem that is real, that a lot of you have had to already think about carefully. Wow, there's a surprise. That makes me feel good as a mother. Okay. Well, that confirms the very first question when you said it was openly discussed in your home. What I'm trying to do now is set the scene for our dialogue by talking a little bit about why this is an issue at this point for our society, why it's polarizing the society. There isn't a position, one true position on any particular issue, particularly women and sexuality. That in fact there's always been a debate and dialogue in the church, and there was often change over time. Every generation works out its own answers to these questions in the context of their lives, in the context of the world that they live in. So let me go back to the 18th and 19th centuries. The change began to occur, interestingly, on the side of Protestant churches. Anglican, Lutheran, Calvinist clergies all had large families. It meant that they lived in relative poverty. So in 1874, the average Anglican clergyman in England had 5.2 living children. By 1911, the average family size of Anglican clergy had dropped to 2.3 children. In short, Protestant ministers disobeyed the church and started restricting their families. The 1920s was the time when birth control campaign was being waged by the first wave of feminists. Contraceptives were labeled, quote, the most repugnant of modern aberrations, representing a 20th century renewal of pagan bankruptcy. So this idea that birth control will lead to immorality, but the Great Depression had a powerful effect. In 1930, the bishops of the Anglican Church approved a resolution stating, in those cases where there is such a clearly felt moral obligation to limit or avoid parenthood, other methods may be used, provided that this is done in the light of the same Christian principles. The context changes, the view of the church may change. It was the Depression. Wanting people to have lots of children was obviously not a good idea. Of course, the Catholic Church responded very differently to these same pressures. In 1930, Pope Pius XI issued of chaste marriage, forbidding all forms of birth control. He said, those who indulge in such are branded with the guilt of a grave sin. There were real anxieties about birth control in Protestant churches. Most Protestant churches accepted the use of birth control in marriage, but they were worried that it was going to lead to sex outside of marriage and promiscuity. As a result, Protestant churches in America split. So then we jump up to the 60s, which was known for sexual liberation, primarily because of the development of the birth control pill, which gave people considerably more control over pregnancy. So in both Protestant and Catholic churches, anxiety that contraception would lead to sex before or outside of marriage grew in the age of birth control pills. In response to that, the Catholic Church reaffirmed that artificial birth control was not allowed. Even in a hierarchical church where the Pope has all the authority, there was a debate. The Canadian Catholic Church simply rejected Humanae Vitae. They said, the unity of the church does not consist in bland conformity in all ideas. So even within the Catholic Church, there was debate about how to approach this problem. And then, of course, the passage of Roe versus Wade brought the issue to a head. The Supreme Court ruled that most state and federal anti-abortion laws violated a constitutional right to privacy. Mainline Protestant churches endorsed legalized abortion. Criswell, who's a very conservative leader in the Southern Baptist Convention, said, "I have always felt that it was only after the child was born and had life separate from its mother that it became an individual person. Abortion clinics were established. The birth rate did not drop. And that means that legalized abortion did not make more women choose to have abortions. The maternal mortality rate did drop, which means that many women died in illegal abortions, and those women were no longer dying." And it's in the 80s when everything changed and shifted. The rise of televangelism politicized the religious views of those churches that had rejected birth control earlier on. Television made a giant congregation of all of these churches and made them a political force. In 2003, the Southern Baptist Convention reversed its earlier liberal position. So actually they had supported birth control, but now abortion was seen as a form of birth control, so it was the idea that birth control actually naturally led to abortion, or that they were one and the same. On one side is the idea that abortion is killing an innocent unborn human being. Second concern, clearly, is teenage sexuality. Is it good or bad? How young is too young? We know this double standard still exists. There's pressure on guys to actually get sexually involved or to have sexual experience, and girls are caught in a very funny double bind. The big question here is, how did you learn to be responsible about your own sexuality? Sex education classes sure did not come off very high on our list of influences. And media is certainly not a particularly helpful source in this regard. So how does our society want to think about how young people should become sexually active, and what counts as being responsible? Is responsible parenthood a moral issue? And by that meaning, I can't be a responsible parent. I can't earn a living. I can't support a child now. Are population and poverty moral issues? And is this position, this sort of absolute position on pro-life position, a distraction from other moral problems that then seem not to count for very much? The increasing gap between the rich and the poor, racism, the money politics and corruption that was behind the Enron scandal, and the destruction of the environment that comes from overpopulation. And then we have another issue that we want to think about that gets raised in this debate. How much is the attitude, the pro-life movement, a backlash against feminism? McGuire, the author of your book, Sacred Choices, writes, "Our public debate images the well-being of early gestating fetuses powerfully as the innocent unborn. The well-being of a pregnant woman, willingly or unwillingly pregnant, is hardly mentioned." He suggests that this religious fundamentalist position is motivated by fear of the changes implied by giving women equal rights and an unconscious hatred of women. You can see in the stories of women of power, where Joan of Arc is a woman of power, but she gets both betrayed and killed. And Kanaki, and in the Hindu situation, I think it's very much clearer that women are considered to be dangerous, powerful women, and you don't want them in charge. They might get out of control. There is a debate going on in all religious traditions. And mostly what we hear is a religious position that rejects abortion. So he wants to foreground a religious position that makes allowance for the need for abortion and contraception. The documentary of a woman who had an abortion and realized that she felt very isolated and alone because women never talk about the experience. Mostly, the ones who do talk about it are people who have gone over to pro-life and talk about how awful it was. And she wanted to bring together a group of people who talked about their different, very different experiences. It's called Abortion Diaries, and it tries to capture some of the feelings that women who, for one reason or another, had an abortion had. The primary feeling being isolated, alone. Nobody talks about this. It's a big secret. In our society, even if you're pro-choice, you don't go around advertising, mostly people don't go around advertising the fact that they had an abortion. And if they had an abortion, they're not comfortable with it. There is nobody who is pro-abortion. It doesn't exist, okay? But one way of defending yourself, even from your own feelings, is to pretend like it's no big deal. Yeah, no big deal. I did it. It is never no big deal. You may pretend it's no big deal. You may even believe it's no big deal. But in fact, sooner or later, all kinds of feelings come back about it. It's not a choice that women make easily, even if they pretend that they do. I would make it equivalent to the very terrible, terrible choice a young man used to have to make, particularly in my generation when there was a draft, and he was drafted, and he was sent off to war, and he was asked to kill people. We don't damn him for doing that, but we know that men come back from war changed. It changes who they are.